Ladies and gentlemen.
Question for you. What is respiration? Any guesses? All right, so respiration is not what we would, when we count respirations, as part of our vital signs assessment, is count the number of the patient's respiratory rate. However, that's a little bit misleading because respirations is different than ventilation. So respirations is something that happens at the cellular level. Ventilations is a process of bringing air in and out of our lungs. So it's probably more appropriately to say, what is a patient's ventilatory rate versus respiratory rate? And I know it's minute, but just I want you to know the difference between the two. Ventilation is the mechanical process of bringing air into the lungs, and respiration is the gas exchange at the cellular level. So let's review back what do we need for adequate ventilation, right? We need our intercostal muscles to work, we need our diaphragm to work, we need an open airway. So we need an airway out to the ambient air. Remember that 21% of oxygen that's out there. We need a way to get that oxygen out in the air into our lungs. So looking at the review of anatomy, and we'll cover that in just a moment. So we gotta get the air outside into our lungs. So that's the process of ventilation. And then we have respirations. And respirations, there's 3 different types of respirations listed. We have external respiration, internal respiration, and cellular respiration. External respiration occurs at the villi. So this is the gas exchange at the villi where the oxygen is getting onto the red blood cells and carbon dioxide is leaving the blood, getting back onto the villi to be exhaled. So bringing in oxygen at the through ventilation at the external respiration side, and our villi is where the gas exchange, villar capillary membrane is where the gas exchange is taking place, and that's the external respiration. So now we get oxygen on our red blood cell, now we got to get it to the cell. So once we goes to cell, but before we get there, we have internal respiration. Internal respiration is a gas exchange process that occurs between the cells and the systemic capillaries. So this is also known as cell capillary gas exchange, responsible for delivering oxygen to the cells and removing carbon dioxide from the cells. So we have our external respiration at our villi. We have an internal respiration that's at the cellular level. And then we have cellular respiration. So cellular respiration metabolism, this is the aerobic metabolism. Remember what we need for aerobic metabolism, we need oxygen. And if we don't have oxygen, we're going into anaerobic metabolism. Remember, without oxygen and glucose, you're only producing 2 ATPs, and ATPs are needed for your sodium-potassium pump. If your sodium-potassium pump fails, then your body's going to fail. So if our ATP is needed for a sodium-potassium pump to allow our cells to function normally, in anaerobic metabolism, so we have 2 ATPs. With aerobic metabolism, we have up to 32 or 34 ATPs. So also we have a lot more energy that's being produced from our cells in aerobic metabolism. And so this is what we're trying to make sure that our patient has. So everything we looked at previously in our last video series was looking at sodium potassium pump, aerobic, anaerobic metabolism, make sure you have a patent airway. So all that lines up to understanding this is the process of getting oxygen through ventilation into our villi, the external respiration. Then it goes to internal respiration and then to cellular respiration. So if we're lacking oxygen in any one of those components, then we're gonna have problems with cellular respiration. So we're looking at oxygen pathway, right? So oxygen from the air, we're breathing in, goes to our lungs. From there, it jumps onto in our blood, our red blood cells. It goes to the cells. From the cells, from the capillaries into the cell is the internal respiration. Then we have the cellular respiration is actually gas exchange from the minute little cell, the cell in your toes or in your eyeballs. So there, then we have gas exchange there, and for that process to start. So considering that and considering our anatomy, if we have a problem getting air in, if we have a problem in our lungs, or if we have a problem with perfusion, you're going to have a problem with oxygenation and respiration. So what is our respiratory system? So obviously our respiratory system is just the pathway, or airways is a pathway to get air in. So we divide our respiratory system, or airway anatomy rather, into an upper and lower airway. So our upper airway deals with our nose or nasal pharynx, our mouth or oral pharynx. Then we have our laryngeal pharynx. That's all your upper airway. So anything from your nose, mouth, and your back of your throat, or your pharynx, down to your larynx. Larynx is to the voice box. So anything from above your vocal cords up is upper airway. Everything from vocal cords down is lower airway. So your upper airway extends from nose and mouth to the cricoid cartilage, and the cricoid cartilage is there, right around what would be the Adam's apple. So in unresponsive patients, the tongue can obstruct the upper airway, and the epiglottis may not close. So your tongue is the number one cause of upper airway obstructions. It's not necessarily choking on the grate or any of that stuff. The number one cause of airway obstructions, upper airway obstructions, is the patient's tongue. So we're going to look at this model. So we have, imagine this being your upper airway, okay? So tongue, teeth, etc. And inside, so there's our tracheal or glottic opening, tracheal opening. This section here is our epiglottis. So air has to make its way down, and this would be the pharynx sitting up here. So nasal pharynx, oral pharynx, and then pharynx goes down to our glottic opening or tracheal opening. This is the upper airway pathway for oxygen to make it down. So this is your cricoid cartilage. This section here is your cricothyroid membrane. So your cricothyroid membrane is not necessarily important as EMT, but it would be as a paramedic, because as a paramedic, this is the location we would do surgical airways. So we can either do a needle cricothyrotomy or a surgical cricothyrotomy. So surgical cricothyrotomy is we're incising here to create an opening, because here is our vocal cords. So we see the difference in the length. So the vocal cords being from here to there. So if we have an obstruction above the vocal cords, then, and we cannot clear it. Now we have means of clearing it at an ALS level. At the EMT level, we're very limited to basic maneuvers, which would include abdominal thrust, suctioning, etc. So in extreme cases, if we have an occlusion that we cannot clear, we will do surgical airway, or at least a needle cricothyrotomy. So this is your cricoid cartilage, cricothyroid membrane. This is your trachea, and then your where the left and right bronchi split off is your known as your carina. So trachea, carina, which is at the brachial split, right bronchi, left bronchi, and then it breaks down to bronchioles and then onto alveoli. So that's your upper airway. There's some 3D models it's available on Canvas. I want you to explore, separate just the airway process, and also looking at the lungs. So this is just anatomy of the upper airway, and our tongue is the number one cause of upper airway obstructions.